I'm an 18-year-old girl and live with my parents on their farm. We have a relatively big house with a nice back patio. We got a hot tub a while back, which my parents use a lot, and I sometimes join them. Since I have my own car, my parents have gotten more comfortable with leaving me at the house when they go away for extended periods of time. The longest they've been gone is almost a week, and they kept in contact with me the entire time. I just take care of our animals and relax when I'm not working, and I've gotten used to being alone. My parents were both raised in farming and ranching families, but I was a city kid until they bought a farm and moved us out here. I'm used to it now, but it took quite a bit of getting used to, considering I'd lived in our previous house for 13 years and knew the city like the back of my hand. You could have placed me anywhere, and I'd be able to find my way back home one way or another. It's been a few years, and I consider myself well adjusted. Obviously, there are pros and cons, but I'm at peace with where we are now. One thing that took a lot of getting used to was how much space we have. In my old house, my bedroom window lined up with my next-door neighbor's kitchen window, and so my curtains were drawn shut 95% of the time. Now, with my bedroom being on the second floor and our neighbors being about 100 yards away, I can get changed with the window open and not worry about being seen. I mention this because it's unusual to have anyone walk past our driveway nowadays, as opposed to the city, where it was weird when people didn't pass by. Anyway, this took place a few weeks ago, and my parents had gone to a distant cousin's wedding, leaving me at the house to look over the farm. I was fine with this as I didn't really know the cousin very well, but I sent my well wishes with my parents, and we sent constant updates back and forth for the few days they were gone. Earlier, I mentioned that we have a hot tub on our back patio. I believe it was the second or third night, and I'd gotten home from work absolutely exhausted, and decided to relax in the hot tub for a bit to soothe my sore muscles before going to bed. I'm a bit of a night owl, so by the time I'd taken a nap and had dinner, it was around 11 p.m., and the sun had pretty much set. Another one of my favorite things about living on our farm is the lack of light pollution. I can look up and easily see the stars above me. I've always been into astrology and astronomy, and I love stargazing. That was part of the reason I waited so long before going out to the hot tub. Anyway, I went out, got myself settled, and just sat in the hot water, enjoying the stars and heat and occasionally sipping my drink that I brought out with me. It was still light enough that I could see the edge of our property, but dark enough that I could see the stars relatively well. I had probably only been out there for about 10 minutes when I suddenly got a chill down my spine, and it wasn't from the breeze on my heated skin. I felt like I was being watched. Immediately, I snapped out of my daze and turned to where I felt the feeling was coming from. It took my eyes a bit to adjust. I'm nearsighted but didn't wear my glasses outside, and when they did, I felt my stomach drop at what I saw. From the patio looking straight ahead, you can see our barn, which has some fences connected to it that make up a couple of pens. Our older horses are in the largest pen to the right of the barn, and behind that pen is a large field that stretches to a row of saplings. Behind those saplings is a barbed wire fence which indicates the edge of our property. To the left of the barn is a patch of trees that lead into the forest that surrounds our property, though there are a few divots here and there where we've set up some other farm things like a garden and chicken coop. While I couldn't see directly behind the barn, I could see beyond it into the field behind the pens, which is where I spotted what I figured caused my feeling of unease. A few feet out of the forest, standing between two of the saplings at the edge of our field, was a figure of what I assume was a person, just standing there in the darkness. I immediately knew that was where the feeling was coming from, and I stood up in the hot tub and turned to face the person. For a few moments, I just stood there looking at them. I don't know if they saw me, but when they didn't move after me staring at them for a solid minute, I decided enough was enough and got out of the hot tub. I closed everything up as quickly as I could while trying not to look panicked and went inside, where I immediately turned on all the lights, shut all the windows, and locked all the doors. My dogs had been inside the whole time, none the wiser to the trespasser, and I figured it'd be best if I didn't alert them to what was going on, in case it turned out to be nothing, even though I was pretty sure I was right about what I'd seen. I debated on calling the police, but I lived 20 minutes from the nearest town, so by the time they got here the person would likely be gone. Besides, it was midnight at this point, and I didn't want to wake any of my neighbors with the commotion authorities may bring. I resolved to sit in the living room with my dogs and keep an eye on the person from inside. Our living room has windows that face outside in the same direction our back door to the patio does, so I could still see the same view from the hot tub, albeit a little more difficult with the lights on. But ever since I'd seen the figure, it was impossible to not notice them afterward. The thought crossed my mind to grab my stepdad's rifle from the basement, but I had no idea where he stored it, or even how to use it, so it wasn't a wise idea, especially because going to get it would mean I'd have to leave my post in the living room and leave the person unsupervised. The more time passed, the more antsy I became. The person was just standing there, not doing anything, in the same position I'd spotted them in, and their apparent lack of motive was unnerving me like nothing else. I resolved that if they didn't leave within the next half hour, I'd call the police, because by that point the person would have been standing there for about an hour, trespassing on our property. More time passed. I stayed in the living room, my phone in hand and dogs at my feet, looking out the window every few minutes to see if the figure was still there, which they were. By now it was 12:15 in the morning, and they still hadn't moved. Internally, I was thinking about who this person could possibly be, and what reason they'd have to do this. We're a friendly community, and we know pretty much all of our neighbors, though everyone mostly keeps to themselves. It was unlikely that anyone knew my parents weren't home and that I was alone. There were 2 vehicles parked in our driveway, mine and my mom's, as my parents had taken my stepdad's truck to travel in. As far as I knew, we didn't have any issues with anyone, which made this scenario even more confusing and terrifying. It was 12:20 when things finally changed. As I was looking out the window for probably the 50th time that night, I saw the figure move. I froze, not moving a muscle, as I watched them turn and walk back the way I assumed they'd come, to the left where they disappeared behind the barn, presumably back into the forest. My relief was only temporary, because while they were gone, they could still very well be on our property, just hiding out in the trees. The feeling of being watched was gone though, which made me feel a little bit better, though not by much. I decided to pull an all-nighter and stayed up until the sun rose. I passed out on the couch. I woke up around 1 p.m. and had a moment where I thought I'd dreamt the whole thing. Just in case, after I finished my chores, I made my way across the field behind the animal pens to our property line and walked from one end to the other, to where the figure would have disappeared behind the barn, to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. It had been dry for the past week, so the grass and dirt didn't show any footprints or any sign anyone had been there at all, which made me suspect that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I have a history of being paranoid because of my anxiety, and have had multiple nervous breakdowns over things that turned out to be inconsequential. Still, I couldn't just forget about that feeling I'd gotten in the hot tub that night. The unmistakable feeling of having someone's eyes on me and not being able to tell who. To this day, I have no idea who it could have been, and to be honest, I don't really want to. Nothing like that has happened since, and I'm hoping it stays that way. To the figure that stood at the edge of my parents' property and watched me in the hot tub in the middle of the night, let's not meet. So this is something I've kept completely to myself, except for a confused call to my best friend the morning after to try and figure out if what I thought happened actually happened. Truthfully, the event that caused this incident was my fault, and also so stupid that I think I've been too embarrassed or mad at myself to share the story. I had only been living in New Orleans for about 2 weeks the night this occurred, and while I'd never been to New Orleans once in my life prior to moving there, a decision resulting from my desperation to get a job out of college, I am from a similarly large metro area in the American South, so I'm familiar with the dynamic of a city like this. One minute you'll see kids playing catch in the streets and young couples walking arm in arm down tropically adorned sidewalks, and the next you'll see dilapidated houses, still not made whole since Katrina and further degraded from Ida, gang violence, young boys posted up on street corners, and unimaginable poverty tied to rampant drug abuse. In the end, it's just all about knowing where to go and which areas to avoid entirely. Anyway, I was driving home from running some obscure errand at night around 9:30 p.m. that caused me to drive through St. Claude. For those who don't know, this is certainly one of those neighborhoods that should be avoided if possible. As I came upon a stop sign right next to a small community center or food bank place, I suddenly slammed on the brakes due to driver's instinct, before really even understanding why I did it. Standing just feet away from my front bumper was a tiny cat, its wide eyes staring back at me in terror as it became briefly blinded by my headlights. That damn cat. This is where my stupidity comes into play. I didn't really know where I was or how dangerous of an area it was, and without even thinking for a single moment, I stepped outside of the car to assess the situation, maybe see if I could help the little guy. I didn't even remove my keys from the ignition as I figured I'd only be there for a little bit, nor did I grab my phone from the charger. I thought I'd either be able to beckon the cat and help it, or it would dart away and then I'd slip back into my car and head home. What I didn't realize when I knelt down on the pavement was that I was too close to the barely open car door. Of course, when I stood up, I bumped it and it immediately swung shut. No big deal, I thought, assuming the door would be unlocked, only to feel my heart sink when it didn't budge. Well, great. I didn't panic immediately. After trying all 4 doors and cursing myself for a solid minute for being such an idiot, I spotted a man sitting on the steps of the community center eating, and he spotted me. Noticing my situation, he slowly stood and came to the back of my car with his bag of Raising Cane's chicken, plopped it down on the hood, and proceeded to enjoy his dinner on the back of my Subaru. By this point, I'd already been there for about 10 minutes, so honestly, the company was relieving. I didn't look as helpless to passers-by with him there. For context, I'm 5 feet tall and was wearing a tiny tank top to fend off the brutal New Orleans summer heat. After I explained my situation, he told me he could try to jimmy the door open, and desperate to get back in, I agreed. It was useless, unfortunately, and I could tell he was just fiddling around. I trotted over to a small church across the intersection where I spotted a few people closing up for the night. Sanctuary, I thought. Nice churchgoers have to help a woman lost and alone, right? Wrong. The man locking up looked straight through me back at the guy trying to open my locked car, shook his head and shot me a glance that said, "Do you think I'm stupid?" Then he stepped right into his car. I felt the tears welling up but quickly told myself to suck it up and walked back over to my car. By the grace of God, the random stranger let me use his phone to call a locksmith, called Papa Lock, who told me he'd be there anywhere between 45 minutes and 4 hours. Great. After about 25 minutes of chit-chatting, the man informed me that his shift was about to start, and just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. This is when the gravity of my situation really began to sink in. I became acutely aware of my surroundings and the men who had been circling the block on their bicycles during our conversation. I don't know about y'all, but I don't know many grown men who ride around leisurely on bikes after 10 p.m. just for the fun of it, especially not in the same big circles in the same neighborhood. I heard the distant squeak of the wheels, and before I could duck for cover, they lapped the block again, now aware that I was utterly alone. They continued down the block, and I realized I needed to find somewhere to be by the time they returned. I swiftly walked towards the community center, but I quickly realized it was too illuminated, and I'd be making myself a beacon. Plus, as I rounded the corner, I saw a tall man standing in total darkness along the side of the building, just staring straight ahead at the steps. Desperate, I jogged over to the church, hearing the wheels nearing again, and squatted down behind the big sign out front. As I sat in the dirt, I couldn't help but cry just a little. The combination of fear and frustration really pushed me over the edge. After a while, I didn't hear any more movement. My butt hurt from sitting on the ground, and the bugs were coming out beneath me, so I decided to move like some stupid game of hide and seek. I had spotted a fenced-off area that looked like a restaurant earlier, and after finding the door unlocked, I darted inside and latched it behind me, sighing with relief. At that point, I situated myself at a table where I could peer through the fence at my car to see if the locksmith pulled up. After what felt like days, but was probably 1 to 2 hours, the horrifying realization dawned on me. I had only made one call to Papa Lock and gave a vague description of the intersection. What if they couldn't find me? What if they had already driven past and were long gone? I didn't know if I should keep waiting or venture back out. After about 30 minutes, I decided I would just have to go out there. The men were gone, and although it was a bad neighborhood, it would only get worse the later it got. It's so painfully obvious in retrospect. But of course, the moment I left the safety of the restaurant, those wheels began to round the corner. Great. I couldn't have looked more out of place and vulnerable. I felt so exposed, but there was no time to go back across the intersection to the fenced area, and to get to the church, I'd have to run through the path of the two men. As I sprinted toward my car, a black truck rolled by, and to my horror, stopped just moments after passing me, put it in reverse, and slowly rolled back in my direction. I almost resigned myself to my seemingly inevitable capture or assault as I watched it come toward me. I pretended to walk away as if I weren't utterly aimless. The men on the bikes were so close now. Then, as if in an episode of CSI, the Papa Lock truck rounded the corner. I instantly began waving my arms to flag them down, and as the black truck drove off, my savior parked his van. Apparently, he had been looping around the area for 20 minutes trying to find me and was about to give up to go help another stranded woman. If I had stayed behind the fence, he likely would have, and I would have been left without any means of communication to call anyone else for help. The moment I got inside my beloved Subaru, I began sobbing at the click of the locks behind me. God, it was pure relief to be secured within a locked space. Even as I'm writing this now, I feel dramatic, like I was freaking out over nothing. But in my recollection, working through the details does help to validate my experience. So to those men on their little bikes, let's never meet again. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Houston. While it wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked, it was relatively peaceful. Still, Houston has a way of turning situations from 0 to 100 quickly, so locking the doors was second nature to everyone. Most of the time, the worst problems were teen vandalism or car break-ins, annoying but nothing truly scary. At the time, I worked retail at a clothing store that closed at 9. One night, a co-worker I was becoming friends with asked if I could give her a ride home. Her place was a bit out of the way, but I didn't mind. Her neighborhood was on the sketchy side, but I didn't think too much about it. I drove her to her apartment and we sat in the car chatting for a bit before she headed inside. As she walked to her door, I stayed in the car watching to make sure she got in safely. Around me, some residents were outside drinking and talking loudly, something that would have been unusual in my neighborhood at 10 p.m. on a weeknight, but here it seemed normal. She blinked the lights from inside to let me know she was safely in, and I headed back home to my parents' house. This was before cell phones were common, so we had a routine. I'd call her from my house once I got home to confirm we were both safe. I don't really remember the drive home. I probably cranked up some tunes, sang along, and parked in the driveway. The outside lights were on. Mom always made sure of that. I went inside without any issues. Now, a bit about my parents. They were alcoholics, though not the mean kind. By day, they functioned okay, but by night it wasn't uncommon to come home to find them passed out. That night, I found my mom sprawled on the couch, TV still blaring. Dad was likely passed out in his man cave. From experience, I knew better than to turn off the lights or TV. If I did, Mom would wake up irritated, complaining that I'd woken her up. So I left everything as it was and went to the bathroom to wash up. After getting ready for bed, I called my friend to let her know I was home. One of my bad habits is that I'm terrible at ending conversations. Even though I was tired and had finals the next day, we kept rambling on about work and other random things. I was lying in bed, lights off, talking, when something caught my attention. My room was at the front of the house, and there was this weird wall in front of my window. A mid-century modern thing that didn't make much sense but blocked some light from passing cars. The occasional car would pass by, casting a square of light on the wall. It was something I barely noticed anymore. But that night I noticed beams of light moving oddly across the wall. Flashlights. I paused, thinking it might be some kids messing around. Our house had never been a target for pranks, so I wasn't too concerned, but it was strange. My friend urged me to call the police, but I wasn't a fan of that idea. Flashlights in the yard didn't seem like enough to bother the cops about. Besides, what could they do? Still, I decided to check things out. I see well in the dark and the lights in the living room were still on, so I didn't bother turning any extra lights on. I told my friend I was going to check the front door. It must have been a long conversation by this point for what happened next to unfold. As I neared the living room, I heard something coming from the kitchen. A strange, metallic slapping sound. I told my friend and she insisted again that I call the police. But for what? Flashlights? Weird noises. The kitchen lights were on too. You have to picture it. The house looked like it was fully awake. The living room lights were on, the TV was on, the kitchen was lit up. But my mom was completely passed out on the couch. so I headed toward the kitchen, curious about the noise. At the very end of the kitchen was a small window with metal blinds. The blinds were rattling, making that metallic slapping sound. For a second, I thought, is the window open? We weren't the kind of people who left windows open. Occasionally, we'd crack one if something burned in the kitchen, but it was always brief. As I stood there, staring at the window trying to make sense of it, I saw something that stopped me cold. The front of a shoe on the sill. I screamed, and I don't just mean a little yell. I unleashed a banshee wail. I screamed so loudly I probably made up for a lifetime of low talking in that one moment. The foot vanished. My mom jolted awake and my friend was shrieking on the other end of the phone. From the back of the house, my dad came running out with his gun. I hung up the phone and called the police. Grabbing another gun, I followed my dad outside. Now, I'm not a gun person, and going outside was incredibly stupid. But my scream had done its job. No one was there anymore. Feeling like I'd watched one too many police shows, I told everyone not to touch the windowsill, imagining the cops would dust for fingerprints or take shoe impressions to track down the culprit. It was almost cute how naive I was. The police arrived half an hour later. It was a good thing we weren't in any real danger by then. In the meantime, my mom started doubting what I'd seen, suggesting maybe she'd left the window open after all. But no, the police confirmed that the window had been pried open, and that someone had carefully removed all the knickknacks from the sill, setting them quietly on the ground. They hadn't wanted to make any noise. It wasn't until that moment that the true horror sank in. These weren't just thieves looking to grab some electronics. They knew the house was occupied. They were sneaking in for something far worse. But what exactly? I asked when they'd be taking fingerprints, and the officer just chuckled. Nothing was stolen, so they weren't interested. We locked all the windows down, and I stayed up all night, haunted by the question, what were they planning to do to us? I want to talk about one of the scariest things I've experienced, which was quite recent. I'm sorry this is long. Recently I, a 24-year-old female, was living in a women's shelter, and I made some really good friends there. We used to sit at this park across from a temple at night, drinking and smoking, whatever. We'd be there for hours listening to my music, just having fun and talking about our lives. We were all quite young, in our early 20s. I should mention that we were all there due to a fair amount of trauma in our lives, and we connected through that a lot. One night, my friends and I went to a party in the city, where we had been drinking for hours and weren't tired when it was over. So when me and my closest friend there, who was 22 years old, got back to the shelter, we decided to sit in the park, watch the sunrise, and drink a little more. We were there for a while when we suddenly heard R&B or rap music coming from the temple across the street. I might add that we are both mixed-race black girls, and we were very tipsy, so we thought it would be a strange adventure to see who was playing my favorite song so loud in the morning. It could be a potential friend, or we'd learn about the place. It was a beautiful temple. We walked over and the gates were locked. We were disappointed, but then a man came out to greet us and said we could come in to see the temple. He mentioned that it was his music, and he loved that we liked the same songs. We went in and he showed us around the temple. It was beautiful at the bottom, but we noticed a lot of rooms with beds. He told us that if we ever wanted to rent rooms, we could, for an unbelievably cheap price. As homeless girls without much work, we thought it was an amazing opportunity, almost too good to be true. At first, I felt nothing but positive vibes. He showed us his computer, which was playing the music, and asked what songs we'd like to hear. I got comfortable with him, he was funny, and we all got along well. Anyway, we started talking about recreational activities that rhyme with marijuana. We had some, so we offered him some because he was just so cool and chill. He said he would pack ours with our stuff, and that's important later. I should also mention that he was constantly complimenting me specifically, my hair and my skin color, and giving very forward compliments that made me uncomfortable. He asked if I liked Asian men and if I'd ever slept with one. He was of East Asian descent, but I'm not sure from where. He then asked more questions about my sexual preferences and even told us that he gave very bad drugs, ones no one should ever take, to girls so he could sleep with them. He also said he'd seen us sitting at the park sometimes through his window. All of this was becoming a pile of red flags. Then he said that if we had another friend, they could take his room because he was moving soon. That's when I got a weird feeling, so I asked him why he was leaving if the rent was so cheap. He wouldn't answer, dodging the question, and my intuition started telling me something was wrong. I asked if I could get some water. He told me to get it from the fridge, but I went out, and there was another guy who offered me water. I decided to use the tap, but the first man ran out of the room and said, "No, take the one from the fridge." I told him I was fine with the tap. He then walked me back to the room, and I sat down next to my friend. Then he said something disturbing. "I'm moving because I hear people screaming and having orgies at night, banging on my door, and it disturbs my sleep." I was like, what? It was almost like he accidentally let that slip out. I asked him if it was nightmares, ghosts, or real people making these noises at night, but he continued to dodge the questions. I asked him why on earth he hadn't told us this earlier. We were honestly in disbelief, but he kept ignoring what we were saying and started acting strange. I then noticed that when I'd come back earlier, he had closed the door. That's when I realized we needed to get the hell out of there. He said, "You have to listen to this song, you'll love it." And it gets worse. He put on this terrifying chant, almost Viking-like, and played it loud, too loud. He was chanting along and we were yelling at him to turn it off, but he didn't listen. The video showed Viking-like people killing others. As we begged him to turn it off because it was scary, he turned to us fast and screamed manically with his teeth showing, his tongue out, and his eyes wide. It was the most distorted face I've ever seen in real life. He didn't look human. No sane person would act this way. My fight or flight response isn't great, so I sat there laughing it off, frozen in fear. But my friend? She was in fight mode. She threatened to beat him up if he didn't let us out right then. I ran to the door, but he ran at me, so I froze in front of him. He went to open the door, which was locked. We ran out of the house while he laughed manically, speed walking behind us. We bolted out, and even though I was still trying to laugh it off, it was the beginning of the worst panic attack I've ever had. If my friend hadn't been in fight mode, I don't know what would have happened to us. I know it probably doesn't sound that scary, but it terrified me to my core. The way he changed so quickly, his movements, his mannerisms, the way his face didn't look human anymore, and how naive we were to go in there in the first place because it seemed like an innocent temple. We didn't get many answers from the situation because we were too scared to go back or cause problems, which is stupid. We don't know if he was truly troubled, or if people were actually being hurt, tortured, or having orgies there. It also scared me to think that he knew we were homeless and vulnerable, and that he may have lured us in with the music he heard us playing. On top of that, we were completely tripping because he had laced our stuff. I don't think I can say what my friend believed it was, but it was the worst experience ever. And I highly doubt those girls he mentioned in the beginning were there consensually. This happened about 5 years ago. I was 14 at the time and went over to my best friend's house to party because her parents were on vacation. We will call her Kay. We were the same age and had been best friends since we were 11. Kay's older sister, who was 17, decided to stay at a friend's house because she didn't like being home alone and left us there. She told us not to tell Kay's parents and she was left in charge. Kay and I decided to invite over our other friend, whom we'll call Emmy. At 14, we were all pretty reckless and wanted to get drunk and high, so we called Kay's neighbor Hayden over. He brought some alcohol and weed to the house and we started to drink. Once we decided to smoke, we set everything up and realized we didn't have a lighter. We searched all over the house for 30 minutes and couldn't find one. We also looked for matches but came up empty. Hayden said, "We'll just walk to my house. My mom works in the night shift and isn't there." Now, Hayden's house was about a 15-minute walk away, and it was 3 in the morning. But there were 4 of us, so we thought we were safe. I remember Kay, Emmy, and I were all dressed in booty shorts and crop tops, which made us feel a little uncomfortable walking outside like that. But we were drunk, so we didn't pay it much mind. I left my phone behind since my mom tracked my location. We ended up walking for about 3 minutes when an old Honda Civic drove by us. We stopped and watched it go past, and then it stopped. All 4 of us went silent and looked like deer in headlights. We saw the Honda's reverse lights turn on and immediately started to run. We hid in a neighbor's large bushes and watched the car drive slowly by, with some guy hanging out of the window scanning houses. They eventually sped off and we were a bit freaked out but laughed it off because of the adrenaline. We kept walking for another 2 minutes when we heard brakes squeal. We looked behind us and there it was again, the same car. It looked like it had made a loop around the neighborhood. We saw the headlights turn onto the street we were on and immediately started to run again. Kay and I ran to the left, while Hayden and Emmy ran to the right. I couldn't stop laughing from the adrenaline, but Kay was having a panic attack. We stood there in the bushes of a house and watched the car go by even slower. I had to hold Kay's mouth shut because she wouldn't stop panting and freaking out. The car sped off again, and now Kay and I were alone in the dark, with no Emmy or Hayden in sight. I asked her if she wanted to run back home or just run to Hayden's. She was so freaked out that she couldn't make a decision, so I grabbed her arm and told her to follow me. I was running for my life to Hayden's house with Kay trailing behind me on the verge of tears. Hayden's house was near the entrance and exit of the neighborhood, which was alongside a very busy road. As we approached Hayden's house, the same car was behind us, leaving the neighborhood maybe 200 feet behind us. I saw the headlights hit my body, looked at the car, and immediately dove into Hayden's yard. I told Kay to run to the door. The car still hadn't reached the house yet, so I got up and ran for my life to the door. Hayden and Emmy were waiting for us, but we couldn't get the code for the lock to work. So we pressed our bodies against the wall as the car slowly went by one more time, this time with a guy hanging out of it, screaming something at us. Finally, Hayden opened the door. We calmed down, talked about the situation, and said we would never do that again. We searched the house for a lighter but couldn't find one, so we used matches to smoke instead. We got stoned, went to sleep, and Kay, Emmy, and I walked home very sleepy but cautious around 9 in the morning before Hayden's mom came home. It was the scariest moment of my life, but it was also a thrill. I am the single mother of an obnoxiously adorable 7-year-old boy. This happened when he was 5 years old, in the summer of 2018, and the what ifs still haunt me. There is a beautiful park on the river that my son and I used to visit often. On this summer evening, we decided to have a picnic in the park for dinner. When we arrived, there were lots of families playing with their children on the playground. We found a spot in the grass near the water, laid down our big purple blanket, and began to eat. I was facing the playground, just people watching, when I noticed a group of 3 children who seemed to be alone. There were 2 boys and 1 girl, and they looked to be between the ages of 9 and 12. You know that bad feeling you get when something just doesn't feel right? These kids gave me that feeling almost instantly. I brushed it off because, well, they were just kids. My son and I were almost done eating and ready to play when dark clouds began rolling in. We live in Florida, and this is standard for a summer evening, so I decided to wait it out and see if it would pass. It did. Everyone cleared the park except for the group of children I mentioned before. At that point, I realized they were definitely alone. I figured they must live nearby. I took my son to the swing and these kids were just hanging around near us, staring but not saying anything. Then the youngest looking boy came up to my son on the swing and stood in front of it, so my son almost hit him while swinging. He just stood there. I asked him what he was doing, but he did not answer. It made me super uneasy, so I took my son off the swing and over to the jungle gym on the other side of the playground. My son and I played on the other side of the park, and I didn't see the other kids anymore, so I thought they must have left. I sat down on a bench near the jungle gym and watched my son as he played. About 10 minutes later, I looked over toward the parking lot and noticed the same group of kids were still at the park, talking to an older man with a dog. This went on for another 5 minutes, and then the man and the children parted ways. The man walked down the street in the opposite direction, and the children came back to the park and over to the jungle gym where my son was playing. I was still sitting on the bench, which was probably about 10 feet away from the jungle gym, when those kids started hanging around and talking to my son. They were asking him lots of questions like, "How old are you?" and "Where do you go to school?" He was answering while climbing around and didn't seem to be paying much attention. I was watching the other kids the entire time because they gave me an unwavering bad feeling. After a few minutes, they got off the jungle gym and began walking toward the road. I was so fixated on the tops of their heads as they walked away that I didn't realize my son, who was tiny, was walking with them. They were almost to the street when I screamed my son's name, and he turned around and bolted back to me. I asked him where he was going, and he said, "They said they had to show me something." We left immediately. I really don't know if it was sinister or not, but I can't explain the kids trying to lead my son out of the park. I often think about what could have happened if I hadn't been paying attention. Was the old man somehow involved? I spoke with my son about following the stranger danger rule with anyone he doesn't know, even if they are kids like him. We don't play at that park anymore. I drive by that park occasionally and have seen that old man a few times, but I haven't seen those children. I do apologize for the long text, but I've been wanting to share this for a while. This happened years ago when I was in Los Angeles during my freshman year of college. I was 18 years old and walking back to my dorm after an evening class. My dorm wasn't very far from the school building. It was a 5-minute walk down the street. There weren't a lot of students around, but I always took this path back to my place without incident. I had no reason to worry about my surroundings that night. I was about 1 block away from my dorm when I was stopped by 2 individuals, a man and a woman who looked to be in their late 20s. Let's call them Jay and Ann. The street was well lit, so I could see the clipboards and satchels they were carrying. I figured they were recruiters for some club on campus until Jay asked me a peculiar question. "Do you want to know the secret of the universe?" I was taken aback by the question. It wasn't something I'd normally be asked on a Monday night. Being the curious 18-year-old that I was, I entertained his question by saying I didn't know what he was talking about. Jay asked for 5 minutes of my time to elaborate. I ended up listening to him for about 15 minutes as he gave a lecture about finding inner peace, with Anne chiming in occasionally. Eventually, this all led to a discussion about religion, and the so-called secret was about getting into heaven. I wasn't really interested in religion at the time and still am not, and I was disappointed by their answer. They pushed to continue the conversation, but I insisted that maybe another time and tried to walk away. Anne stepped in front of me and reassured me that this was something I needed to hear. Jay approached right behind me. They had surrounded me. I knew it was time to leave. I tried to hide my discomfort while telling them I needed to get home, but the tremble in my voice didn't help. Anne, with a warm but robotic tone, tried to relax me and offered to drive me home. I had been needlessly accommodating to them up to that point, but I firmly said no to that offer. They both asked where I lived, but I started dodging their questions. I considered running home but worried they might chase me. Sensing my discomfort, they attempted small talk, asking about my studies and how I was enjoying school. Then, a car pulled up next to us. The driver got out to greet Jay and Ann. They knew each other. They offered one more time to drive me home. I repeated my no, this time with desperation in my voice. Jay and Ann looked visibly upset. They talked among themselves, and then Ann and the driver got into the car. Jay approached me again holding a clipboard. Attached was an application form asking for my name, address, and phone number. Jay wanted my information to continue the conversation another day. This felt suspicious, but I was relieved he decided to back off. I gave him a fake address and surname. Earlier in our encounter, I had pulled up my phone, so I figured he would try calling my number to verify my identity. That was one of my blunders that night. I reluctantly provided my number and he did call it. He told me he'd be in touch and then got in the car. They drove away. I felt embarrassed by my lack of common sense throughout the incident. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night, unsure who those people were or what they were up to. I just wanted to move on. Jay did try to contact me in the following weeks. I ghosted him, blocked his number, and never heard from him again. I ended up taking a different route home for the rest of the year without incident. I never saw Jay or Ann on campus again. This creepy experience happened when I was in high school, and it has stuck with me. I often wonder if it really happened. It's worth mentioning that my childhood home was in the woods, a very secluded area that could be quite eerie at night. Aside from the moon and stars and the lights from our house, it was pitch black. I'd often wonder if anyone was hiding in those woods. My house had lots of windows, allowing anyone outside to see right in at night. Then again, we had a low crime rate, and I never saw any strangers back there. I must have been about 17 years old. It was a Friday night, and my mom had gone out on a date, planning to be out late. My little brother, who was around 12, was having a sleepover with his best friend. I was tasked with making dinner and keeping the kids out of trouble. I expected no issues since they weren't little kids. They could entertain themselves. It was around 9 or 10 p.m. when I was sitting in my bedroom playing World of Warcraft. Suddenly, my brother and his friend burst through my door, out of breath and screaming my name. I asked what was wrong. My brother's friend spoke up, somewhat paraphrased. We saw a man outside. Insert my brother's name. Thought he saw somebody standing in the yard, so we looked out the window. There was a person just standing there. We couldn't see his face, but we think he was looking right at us, and he was dressed in black. We didn't know what to do at first, and then he ran really fast across the yard, and we think he went behind the trees. My brother looked scared and was on the verge of tears, nodding along to what his friend was saying. I had never known my brother or his friend to make up stories, so I was scared. However, I didn't think it was wise to go outside with a flashlight, yelling hello and expecting a response from whoever was lurking in our yard. I asked them if they were sure they saw a person and if it could have been an animal like a fox, coyote, or deer. They insisted it was a person, staring right at them before running away and hiding. I called my mom to ask what I should do. We weren't too fond of the police, so I wanted to avoid that if possible. My mom was annoyed that I interrupted her date. She thought the kids were lying and telling fake stories and told me to just keep an eye out before hanging up. The kids insisted they weren't lying and wanted to stay in my bedroom until my mom returned. I kept peeking out the windows, but thankfully never saw anyone. I believed them, but I also had my doubts. They seemed genuinely scared, and I didn't think they would make it up. Yet I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they just thought they saw someone, but it was nothing more than a shadow or an animal. They were adamant they knew what they saw. A man dressed in black clothes, and they couldn't see his face. My mind had played tricks on me in those woods before, but I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. I was spooked for a while after that. When my mom arrived home and I recounted the story, she laughed it off and tried to comfort the kids so they could go to bed. After that night, I made extra sure to lock all the doors and windows. I used to live in a townhouse, a duplex by myself with my dog and 2 cats near a train station. There were often commuters who parked outside my place and passed by throughout the day and night. Occasionally, I had cigarettes or other items stolen from my front veranda. Once, my next-door neighbor's ex-boyfriend even came to my door, claiming a hitman was after him and that he had a gun. But none of this scared me like the night I was watched. My dog lived indoors, and I would take him out for a last pee before bed. My backyard light was broken and too high to change the bulb, so I always took him out the front. That night, around 11 p.m., I let him outside. It was a hot summer evening, and I was mindlessly standing on the footpath when I saw movement across the road from me. Out of nowhere, a man appeared, walking diagonally away from me. I thought it was odd because I hadn't seen him come from the other direction. I kept thinking about it. He had come from outside a house that was being renovated, and I knew the owners weren't living there. I wondered if he was planning to steal something. I continued to watch down the road as he turned the corner. Suddenly, I saw his head pop around the corner to see if I was still outside. This gives me the absolute creeps, so I grab my dog and go inside. I turned off all the lights and went upstairs to my bedroom, which faced the street. I figured I would keep an eye on my neighbor's house and call the police if he returned. Peering through the blinds covering the sliding doors leading to a small balcony, I saw a dark figure walk down from the corner and down my street. He moved toward the house across the road, but then I lost sight of him behind a tree that obscured my view. Moments later, he reappeared, stopping at the top of my driveway. He stood there like Jason Voorhees. I kid you not. His arms were out by his sides and his legs were apart in an unnatural stance, as if he were preparing for something, like he wanted to come and kill me. My heart raced so hard I could barely hear. I stood there slack-jawed, staring at this would-be assailant when one of my cats came to see what was happening. The cat slid its body between the blinds and window, further opening them, and I saw the man looking up towards me. Surely he must see me. If he did, he didn't seem fazed. He started walking down my driveway, undeterred and fixated. I lost sight of him beneath the balcony and awning. By this time, my eyes were watering from fear, and tears streamed down my face. I didn't know what to do, so I sat on my bed. I picked up my mobile and dialed my dad, who lived a suburb away. He answered, and I whispered what was happening. He said he would be there as soon as he could. Lying down in bed, I remained as still as possible, tears rolling down my cheeks. I was paralyzed with pure fear, not knowing what the man was doing downstairs or if he could get in. What if I hadn't locked the doors? And then it dawned on me, why am I lying here in the dark crying? I needed to turn on a light. So I did. What felt like a lifetime, but it was probably just a couple of minutes later. My dad arrived, armed with an umbrella. I lived in Australia, so no guns, but a knife would have been more appropriate. I stayed on the phone with him while he searched outside for the man. He was gone. Maybe my turning on the light scared him off. I called the police, who said I should have called sooner. Of course I should have. I don't know why I didn't. They came out with a sniffer dog but didn't find him either. I don't know what he wanted, but for a good year after that I was terrified living there. I'm still a scaredy cat, but reading others' stories makes me realize I'm not alone. We can all learn from these experiences so we know what to do if something scary happens. I am a teenager who helps my dad out on the allotment. For those who don't know, an allotment is like a mini farm where you can plant veggies or keep animals like chickens or rabbits. Recently, I had a creepy experience that still creeps me out. One evening, my dad said we needed to go to the allotment to feed our chickens because he had forgotten to do it earlier that day. It was around 8 p.m. when I agreed, and we drove the 15 minutes to get there. By the time we arrived, it was already dark outside. Not pitch black, but definitely dark. I opened the gates to the allotment and let my dad drive in and then close them. Just as I was about to close the gate, I noticed a black car parked outside. The car belonged to a guy who used to be on good terms with my dad, but their friendship had faded over time. My dad mentioned that this guy had become increasingly mentally unstable after a divorce, which resulted in him losing custody of his kids. Now he lived on the allotment and even slept there. While there were about 20 other allotments in the area, it was just me, my dad, and this guy that night. After my dad parked, we got out and started retrieving the chicken feed from the trunk. While my dad was busy, I glanced at the ex-friend's allotment and saw him staring at us. It was dark, so I could only make out his shadow, but I knew he was watching. A gut feeling kicked in, but I decided to ignore it. We fed the chickens and were about to leave when my dad remembered something he had to get from the shed at the end of the allotment. I was going to follow him in, but felt a strong urge to wait outside instead. As I stood there, I turned to face our gate and noticed it was opening. At first, I didn't see anyone, but then I spotted the guy trying to sneak into our allotment. He locked eyes with me before quietly closing the gate and disappearing. I was frozen. Instead of saying anything to my dad, I didn't want to scare him. This wasn't a horror movie after all. When my dad finally emerged from the shed, we were ready to leave. Suddenly, we heard a sound that resembled an axe hitting wood repeatedly. Something felt off. We quickly walked to our car, started it, and made our way to the gate. I hopped out of the car to open the gate. As I was closing it, I saw something that terrified me. The guy was standing about 20 meters away, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but I could see he was holding something in his hand. Then, without warning, he moved and disappeared into some bushes. My dad got out of the car to lock the gate, glanced at the bushes through the closed gate, and hurried back to the car. We drove off, shaken. I asked my dad if he saw what I saw. He confirmed he had spotted the guy hiding in the bushes, squatting and watching us, holding something that looked like an axe or a knife. We left, terrified but trying to laugh it off, knowing how close we had come to something truly dangerous. A few days later, we returned to the allotment around the same time, 8 p.m. We saw the guy's car parked there and knew we needed to be quick about feeding the chickens. Everything seemed fine until my dad suddenly stopped me and whispered, "He's there in the bushes." My heart dropped. I asked where he was, and my dad said we had about 5 seconds to make it to the car. We quickly ran to the vehicle, got inside, and locked the doors. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of him. He was holding an axe, clearly trying to sneak up on us. I don't know what's up with this guy, but I think he wants to harm us, maybe even kill us.